Iran has damaged quite a few of our bases and our military assets, and that's according to a new report from NBC News.
So there's a big story in the Atlantic about JD Vance that, gosh, he didn't want this war. He's got a lot of problems with this war. It's not because he's planning on running in 2028 and would like to cover his ass. Oh, actually it is for that. In closed door meetings, JD Vance has repeatedly questioned the Defense Department's depiction of the war in Iran and whether Pentagon has understated what appears to be the drastic depletion of US missile stockpiles. And they say that he has brought that concern directly to the president, but there's somebody in the way. Well, who is that? Well, it might be Pete Hegseth.
If you believe America deserves the truth, not spin, hit that like button, subscribe to The Red Verdict, and let's break down what they're not telling you about this Iran situation.
Turns out Iran has damaged quite a few of our bases and our military assets, and that's according to a new report from NBC News. Cenk, this is not surprising. This is something that has been reported by a lot of independent sources, but NBC News apparently has realized that Iran also has military capability and can do some real damage.
Yeah, there's two parts of the story that I find interesting. One is the extent of the damage that they did, including some things that were unprecedented in recent years, which maybe you're tracking it better than I am, Anna, but I was surprised by the level of damage that they had done, which we'll share with you guys in a second. And then secondarily, I was surprised by how much of Iran's military still exists. I halfway bought into the hype about how they were all destroyed. It turns out that's not remotely true. So let's give you the facts.
So NBC cited several sources for their reporting here, including 3 anonymous US officials, 2 anonymous GOP congressional aides, and 1 anonymous person familiar with the damage. All you need to do is pay attention to former military generals who were rejected by the Trump administration for his new administration in the second term, and you'll know the extent of the damage. You don't need to rely on anonymous sources. Nonetheless, the sources claim that the destruction caused by Iran spans across several countries in the Middle East and could cost up to $5 billion to repair. And that's actually a pretty conservative estimate, to be quite frank. More on that in just a bit. According to the sources, Iranian forces managed to strike runways, high-end radar systems. In fact, the radar systems is what they went for first, which was incredibly strategic. Clearly, they had a plan in mind. They knew that the United States was going to attack them, and they knew what they were going to do in response. Dozens of aircraft, warehouses, command headquarters, aircraft hangars, and satellite communications infrastructure. So Iran even managed to bypass American air defenses. So early in the war, an Iranian F-5 fighter jet bombed the US base Camp Buring in Kuwait, despite the base having air defenses, a rare breach that marked the first time an enemy fixed wing aircraft has struck an American military base in years. So since Iran does not have the capability to strike the United States, their plan, once the US struck them and started this war, was to strike US bases in the Gulf region, and that's exactly what they did. Now, these Gulf countries were under the impression that if they host US military bases, that means that it's going to bolster their security. Oops, well, that didn't happen. In fact, at the very start of the war, Trump said, and he literally said this out loud, that he was surprised that Iran struck US military bases. Could it be because Iran showed a great deal of restraint following previous US attacks on their country? Probably, but you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. And so now the real question is whether or not these Gulf countries would even be willing to host US military bases should the US government decide to rebuild those bases. But let me continue with more of the damage. So the $5 billion price tag that I had referenced earlier does not include the cost of fixing some equipment like the radar and aircraft that was destroyed, which is gonna cost a lot of money. So Iran hit US bases in at least 7 different countries: Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. The report claims that detailed information is being withheld from members of Congress, which should be unsurprising. One of the anonymous congressional aides even said that no one knows anything, and it's not for lack of asking. We have been asking for weeks and not getting specifics, even as the Pentagon is asking for a record high budget. If you guys can remember, Donald Trump has requested a defense budget of $1.5 trillion, which is insane, which is absolutely insane. But the administration has even requested that private satellite companies refrain from imaging the US bases that have been destroyed. And that was confirmed by a satellite company called Planet Labs. Now, a Pentagon official also stated the following: "We do not discuss battle damage assessments for operation security reasons. Our forces remain fully operational, and we continue to execute our mission with the same readiness and combat effectiveness." Well, if what we've seen with Iran so far has been the Pentagon's idea of readiness and combat effectiveness, I really don't know what to say. We're in a lot of trouble. And by the way, the fact that we've depleted 80% of our missile interceptors when we're making enemies all across the globe in order to make our little friend Israel happy should be concerning for anyone who has any fear for our national security. NBC's report also acknowledged that Iran's counterattack could hurt the narrative for the foreign policy hawks that can get effed as far as I'm concerned. The issue could embolden critics of America's military presence overseas who have advocated for shrinking the US presence in the Middle East, one US official and one person familiar with that matter said. Well, I mean, I certainly would be in the camp of, if I weren't an American and I were in a country hosting a military base that was getting attacked, yeah, I would be in the camp of maybe we shouldn't host US military bases on our land, but who knows?
No, that's obvious.
Yeah.
They thought that it was going to protect them, and what it did was it endangered them. And so now Saudi Arabia and UAE are looking around, maybe thinking about doing it. Saudi Arabia, not UAE in this particular case, thinking about doing a deal with BRICS instead of us for security, because they're like, all that Israel and America has brought us is pain and trouble and bombings. So we're now less safe because we were stupid enough to make a deal with the Israelis and Americans, basically. So now let's break this down further. By the way, this was said by one of our members a couple of weeks ago, and it's really stuck with me. It was Israeli and Trump racism that actually cost us dearly, because the Israelis came in and told Trump, "Oh, these dumb Iranians, they won't even be able to figure out how to close the Strait of Hormuz." Remember, these are savage Muslim terrorists. They don't know anything. Oh, bombing our bases, your bases in the Gulf? They won't be able to do that at all. Remember, they're barbarian, savage cavemen, right? Oops, oops. So I don't know if you know this, but the Persian culture has been around 200 times longer than America has. That's a lot, okay? So, no, sorry, 20. 250 years to 5,000 years. But no, they know things. They're not, oh, me, ooga booga, like the Israelis want you to believe. And so it turns out, not only have they done massive damage, let me just add on to what Anna said. Yeah, the 5 billion number is a joke because it doesn't include all the radar. We lost apparently dozens of planes. Dozens of planes. What happened to we have total control over their airspace? No, apparently we don't, because our planes keep getting shot down. Okay, apparently 3/4 of Iran's air force still exists. So the whole thing of like, they don't have an air force anymore, not true.
No, they've totally been obliterated.
Yeah, F-5 jet of Iran, as Anna told you, gets past our security and bombs a US base. First time that's happened in years and years and years, right? So apparently their pilots are pretty good and their Air Force still exists. The fast boats are obliterating us in the Strait of Hormuz. They still have plenty of fast boats. And so they don't need to beat an aircraft carrier. They just need the fast boats to plant the mines and leave. So they apparently have an endless source of those. And then on top of all of that, the missiles, we destroyed almost all their ballistic missiles and stuff. No, they have thousands of missiles and drones left. So they have plenty of ammunition left. They don't have the giant ships and planes we have, but they don't need them. But Trump, being like the lowest IQ leader that any country has ever had, was like, our button is bigger than theirs. Our ships are bigger than theirs. Yeah, but brother, Goliath was bigger than David, but the slingshot made a bit of a difference, right? So you've got to calculate, hey, I wonder what that slingshot can do. But apparently everyone in our government is a bunch of morons who are like, it'll be easy against the stupid Muslim savages. Oh no! Well, what happened? What happened, you idiots? Now the entire world economy is in danger, let alone all the people who've been killed by this totally needless war, right?
Exactly.
So, when you look at all this, where we stand now, guys, is not only did the war cost $2 billion a day in the beginning when we're firing off all the rockets, now it's down to $1 billion a day. They're asking for $400 billion extra to fight this war, even though they told us it would be easy and cheap. And then on top of that, there's the economic damage that's coming from all the gas prices and food prices and inflation that's coming. So we're supposed to pay all of this. And Israel says, not enough. Go back into the war and put your stupid ground troops in so they could die instead of Israelis. And we're not done stealing Lebanon, and we're not done trying to create a civil war in Iran so millions of people can die. America's back to work, back to the war, Israel says. And that's where we are today. We're now apparently beholden to our overlords in Israel who demand compliance and that we pay every price there is. So we've lost men, we've lost aircraft, we've lost a significant amount in our military, and finally, 80% of our defensive missiles have already been used up. And Israel says, we don't care, send your ships into the Gulf. And you know why? Because if Iran sinks one of our ships, we're gonna be super angry and we're gonna stay in the war longer. So Israel's like, please, I wonder, Anna, now this is getting over the top. But a lot of people are worried about false flags and
like a USS Liberty type situation.
Oh, how dare you mention facts? Yeah, I don't know what could happen, but I'll tell you what, if somebody hits one of our ships, we should ask a million questions about how that happened, okay?
Yeah, we won't, but it's okay.
Yes, but our
It's not
press will
okay,
of course say, oh no, anyone asking questions of the government is an anti-Semite, and we should all bow our heads. Back to the mines, Americans. You haven't done enough war for Israel yet, right? So that's where we are now, and we're all totally and utterly screwed. This damage, if the war continues, this damage will later be seen as the tip of the iceberg. And the iceberg is going to be a disaster of epic proportions. So there's a big story in the Atlantic about JD Vance that, gosh, he didn't want this war. He's got a lot of problems with this war. It's not because he's planning on running in 2028 and would like to cover his ass. Oh, actually it is for that. But nevertheless, we find out two super interesting things in this story. One is how depleted our munitions are. Wait till you get a load of the specifics on that one. And that's why Trump is like, we'll extend the ceasefire. We did another ceasefire, please don't, right? So you begin to get an understanding of why through this piece. And secondly, apparently there's someone else in this equation that might be thinking for running for president, which I'm a little surprised by. And there's shots fired here, political shots. So let's take a look. Atlantic's piece says the Pentagon may not be telling Trump the full picture about the war. Vice President Vance is worried that the US is running low on weapons. So hence the two parts of the story. The part about running low on weapons is correct, and we'll show you that. The part about Vance being concerned about the war is half correct. He's concerned because he realizes the war is a disaster and he's not gonna be able to win the primary, let alone the general election, if he's seen as in favor of the war, which he actually is. Okay, so, but let's go to the Atlantic piece and I'll break it down one by one. They say, in closed door meetings, JD Vance has repeatedly questioned the Defense Department's depiction of the war in Iran and whether Pentagon has understated what appears to be the drastic depletion of US missile stockpiles. And they say that he has brought that concern directly to the president, but there's somebody in the way. Who is that? Well, it might be Pete Hegseth. So the Atlantic continues, both Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, and General Dean Cain, who chairs the Joint Chiefs of Staff, have publicly said that the US weapon stockpiles are robust and portrayed the damage to Iranian forces after 8 weeks of fighting as drastic. Vance's advisors, who spoke with us on the condition of anonymity, told us that the vice president has presented his concerns as his own rather than accusing Hegseth or Cain of misleading the president. Now, that's him trying to thread the needle. No, I'm not criticizing anybody in the administration, not Hegseth or Dean Cain. At the same time, they're total liars and they keep pumping up that we're doing great when in reality it's a disaster and it's gonna cost me an election. Oh, I mean, I'm very concerned for America, okay? So he's saying Hegseth and Cain are lying to the president. He's throwing them under the bus. We're also gonna get a sense of why that might be in a second. Vance is trying, the advisor suggested, to avoid making this personal or to create divisions in Trump's war cabinet. Sure, wink, wink. Some of Vance's confidants, however, believe that Hegseth's portrayal has been so positive as to be misleading. Now, I'll point out here, so far all the quotes are from Vance insiders and staffers and advisors. That means this is a puff piece for Vance. When Vance's team is leaking it, they write it from a pro-Vance position. If you don't know that about mainstream media, that is a very important Rosetta Stone. Always look for who's leaking it, and 8 out of 10 times, that is the person that will be positively portrayed in the story. In a sense, it's a deal that journalists make with their sources to halfway lie on their behalf as a reward for getting the scoop and the story. And so here they're pretending like that Vance has got a lot of issues with the war. At the end, you're gonna see that's not remotely true, okay? But it is interesting that it's his advisors that are throwing Hegseth and Kane under the bus. And so the Atlantic continues, Pentagon's leaders' positive portrayals present an incomplete picture at best, people familiar with intelligence assessments told us. According to those internal estimates, now here comes a really important real part, Iran retains 2/3 of its air force, the bulk of its missile launching capability, and most of its small, fast boats, which can lay mines and harass traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. Okay, so guys, why do I know that that part is true? Because Vance is partly giving this as an incentive to the Atlantic. I'm gonna give you a nice scoop about how we've been lying about our defenses and Iran's capabilities. So, and in return, I'd like you to present me as someone opposed to the war. And so that's the deal that was had here. Now, so they're not going to tell you that Iran still has 2/3 of its air force if they don't. If Vance was lying about that, trying to puff up Iran, that would blow back on him in a big, big way, and it would be very easy to prove. So this is the part of the story that's true and very concerning. So the entire time Trump has been telling people, and we're gonna talk more about this later in the show, but also convincing the stock market, things are going great, we've destroyed their entire Air Force. Then we find out later from NBC News in a story we covered yesterday, no, one of Iran's F-5 jets even got through our defenses, bombed one of our bases, killed a lot of people. They've apparently downed dozens of our aircraft. We're in much worse shape than we realize. And of all of those things, their Air Force, their missiles, what is doing the most damage? The small boats, because they're the ones blocking the Strait of Hormuz. They continue, Tehran brings more missile launchers back online every day. Roughly half are accessible again after an initial 2-week ceasefire that was scheduled to expire last Tuesday, according to people familiar with the assessments. So things are not getting better, they are getting worse. And since Vance knows internally how bad things are, he's got to tell you that he's against this war, otherwise it's an albatross around his neck. So now let's go back to Hegseth for a second, because here's where he finds himself on the underside of a bus. Several people close to Trump believe that Vance now sees his political future as tied to what happens in Iran, one of the senior officials told us. Of course, okay? And so they're saying, quote, nobody in Trump's inner circle was more worried about the prospect of war with Iran or did more to try to stop it than the vice president. Now that's interesting because that's the New York Times. So that's a separate story that came out just a little while ago. We covered that one too. And again, it's Vance advisors and insiders saying, now remember, Vance was not for this war. Why is he, if the war was going great, why would he be panicking about and screaming to the New York Times and the Atlantic that it is not going well and that the administration is lying to you? Well, that's because he knows for a fact it's going disastrously. Another thing I found out through the Atlantic, which I honestly didn't know until I read that, was it turns out this knucklehead, meathead Hegseth is also thinking of running for president. And his whole thing is like, I am the one who is the most vicious and the most violent and the most pro-war and the most pro-Israel, and I will do everything for beloved Israel and more wars. Okay, so he's already eliminated. Vance, you don't have to worry about him, okay? Like nobody's gonna vote for that. So he's bragging about Venezuela and how the first Iran strikes went well. Yeah, the first ones. How's this war going? And Hegseth said, and he's at least public, right? Hegseth cannot escape this at all. He's the one going, oh, we destroyed them. We beat them so bad. Well, the Strait of Hormuz is still closed. Yeah, but we bombed and we destroyed and we had a lot of fires and we're Team America. No, you're not. You're like the goofy guy that they make fun of in Team America. Okay, so some of this is also political jockeying in particular, but mainly Vance is not worried about Hegseth as much as he's worried about the albatross. So back to the New York Times, they report, in front of his colleagues, Vance warned Trump that a war against Iran could cause regional chaos and an untold number of casualties. It could also break apart Trump's political coalition and would be seen as a betrayal by many voters who had bought into the promise of no new wars. Did he? That's what his advisors are telling you. But I remember the New York Times reporting something else. So let's go to a little deeper in. The vice president thought a regime change war, the New York Times reports, with Iran would be a disaster. Here we go again. His preference was for no strikes at all. Is that right? But knowing that Trump was likely to intervene in some fashion, he tried to steer towards more limited action. Did he? I mean, this is a giant CYA operation to cover Vance's ass, and from mainstream media, because they got leaks and they got scoops. Scoop, JD Vance is against the war that he's 100% in favor of and part of this administration, but we will lie to you all and pretend that he's against the war. Why? Because I saved the best for last. Later, when it seemed certain that the president was set on a large-scale campaign, Vance argued that he should do so with overwhelming force in the hope of achieving his objectives quickly. Okay, so in other words, he didn't say limited strikes, he said go big and fast. In fact, that line is from an earlier New York Times story. That's why that later New York Times story was like, oh, we're pretending JD Vance is anti-war, but it's super inconvenient because earlier we wrote that he was the one that told Trump, don't do limited strikes, go in big with overwhelming force. We got this, we're gonna win this war and I'm gonna be president next. Oh no, it turns out we were racist idiots who believed the Israelis and thought that the Iranians were stupid Muslim savages who couldn't close the Strait of Hormuz or attack our bases. And it turns out we were maniacally wrong, pathetically wrong. So now he's like, backpedal. And the New York Times is like, yeah, remember how we reported earlier that he was the main guy, say, going in favor of going big with overwhelming force? Now we're gonna report, first, we didn't mention this earlier, but first he was against the war, but once he realized he's pathetic and has no ability to convince the president of anything, and he got steamrolled by Netanyahu, then he's decided to go overwhelming force. Now, of course, he didn't write any of that, but it is true about the part where he apparently couldn't prevent the war. And because your best case scenario, even if you believe the JD Vance insiders that he was secretly against the war as he was telling Trump to go big into the war, bigly, huge into the war, even if you believe that, well, brother, that means you were no good at your job, that you could not stop Trump from going to the war if you thought it was a bad idea, that you did get steamrolled by Hegseth and by the Israelis, and you're not very good at this. So even that story is not one that is as positive as Vance thinks it is. And you can see the panic because internally he knows more than we do. This war is gonna end in nothing but disaster, and he's gotta get away from that stench as quickly as possible. And here he's using, interestingly, mainstream media to do that. But we do find out that Hegseth comically thinks he's running for president. JD Vance is purposely kneecapping him. And the Iranians' military situation is way better off than we realize. And those small fast boats are the ones laying the mines. And apparently we cannot stop them at all. And that is why not only is the Strait of Hormuz closed now, we've now gotten to a point where it appears we're worried that we just cannot reopen it. So we have ceded enormous leverage to the Iranians, and our American interests are worse off today than before we started the war. This war, this disastrous war brought to you by Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, JD Vance, and Pete Hegseth, final cherry on top, as he's coming back from the failed peace negotiations from Pakistan, Who's JD Vance calling on his plane? The Prime Minister of Tajikistan. Kidding. Of course, the leader of Israel. He calls Netanyahu. He's like, okay, yes, this peace settlements are scuttled. Mission accomplished. Don't worry. Next, I'm going to have dinner with Miriam Adelson and Paul Singer and all of your Israel First donors you're sending my way to collect millions of dollars while I'm pretending to be against the war. That call actually did happen. He reported to the Prime Minister of Israel about what happened in the peace negotiations. I don't know if he called him before he called Trump, but Netanyahu's his daddy. He did go raise money from Adelson and Israel First right after he landed. So JD Vance has thrown his lot in with the pro-war, pro-Israel, America Last faction, and he's desperately using mainstream media to try to deceive you. Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.
All right, so I just watched this breakdown claiming Iran has dealt serious damage to US bases and that our military position is weaker than we've been told. Let's slow this down and separate facts from political spin, because there's a lot of narrative warfare going on here. First, let's be clear about one thing. Iran is not a joke. Any serious conservative or patriot understands that, underestimating your enemy is how you lose wars. That's not strength, that's arrogance. So the idea that Iran still has capabilities, missiles, boats, and an air force presence should not shock anyone paying attention. A nation that has spent decades preparing for asymmetric warfare is going to fight differently from the United States. Now, the claim that Iran has struck multiple US bases across the Middle East and caused billions in damage is significant. If even half of that is accurate, then Congress and the American people deserve transparency. You don't ask for trillion-dollar defense budgets while hiding basic battle damage assessments. Accountability matters. That's not a left-wing or right-wing issue. That's a taxpayer issue. But here's where I push back hard on the narrative in that clip. They want you to walk away thinking America is weak, defeated, and completely at the mercy of Iran. That's not reality. The United States still has the most advanced military on the planet, unmatched logistics, and global reach. What we're seeing is not weakness. It's the cost of engaging in a complex regional conflict, where the enemy doesn't fight by conventional rules. Iran didn't try to hit the US mainland, because they can't, so they targeted bases in the region. That's expected. That's how proxy and regional warfare works. The real question is not, did Iran strike back? Of course they did. The real question is, was there a clear strategy going in? And is there a clear objective coming out? And that's where conservatives should be asking serious questions. Are we protecting American interests? Or are we drifting into another endless Middle East conflict without a defined win condition? Are we prioritizing US national security? Or are we reacting emotionally and escalating without a long-term plan? Because strength is not just about firepower. Strength is about discipline, clarity, and knowing when and how to act. Now, let's address the claim about depleted missile stockpiles. If it's true that a large percentage of interceptors have been used, that's not just a battlefield issue. That's a readiness issue. That affects deterrence globally, including against China and Russia. That's something leadership must be honest about and fix immediately. At the same time, the media and political commentators pushing this story are doing what they always do. They exaggerate the worst-case scenario to push an anti-American narrative, suggesting the US is collapsing while ignoring the broader strategic picture. That's irresponsible. America is not collapsing, but bad decisions, lack of transparency, and unclear strategy can weaken even the strongest nation over time. Here's the bottom line. Iran hitting back is not surprising. Damage in war is not surprising. What matters is whether our leadership is being honest with the American people, and whether there is a real plan to win or de-escalate. Because patriots don't blindly cheer war, and we don't blindly accept narratives either. We demand results, accountability, and strategy that actually protects American lives and interests. And right now, there are more questions than answers.